Welcome. I'm Dr. Owen Anderson, and in this lecture, we're looking at what it means to derive the moral law. And so we'll be looking at going from the nature of things to what we ought to do. Now, by way of reminder from previous lectures, the moral law describes the choices we must make to attain the good. That's the sense in which it's law-like. In other words, it is law-like, or it is a law, in that if you do this, you get the good. If you don't do it, you don't get the good. And so what that means is that for each law, there is a positive and a negative. Whether it's stated positively or negatively, we might say, don't do this, but then with that don't is a positive, you should do the following, the opposite. And each moral law, therefore, has both of those. It states what you ought to do and what you ought not to do. And not only that, the moral law is, I'm going to use the word spiritual. What that means is not merely material and outward, but it changes the inner person. That's what I mean by spiritual. I don't mean like a misty, cloud like version of yourself, but that it is the inner person changes. So it's not enough just to do outward conformity. And in that case, a person who's like tied down on a chair is the person who's best keeping the moral law. They're not breaking any laws, but their inside could be thinking all kinds of evil thoughts. And so the moral law changes your inner person also. It applies to your thinking as well as your behaviors. And so to derive a moral law is to show that we ought to do something based on our nature as rational beings. So you go from some truth about human nature to a conclusion of what you ought to do. And from there, you could make many applications of the moral law to different aspects of life. The moral law is universal. It applies to all, and comprehensive. It applies to all aspects of human life. So universal means it applies to all humans, and comprehensive means it applies to all aspects of human life. But each moral law, while it must be obeyed, moral law must not be done at each moment, but at relevant time. So, in other words, if there's a moral law that says don't speed in your car, well, it's still a law you should keep even when you're riding your bicycle, but it doesn't apply to you then because your bicycle can't possibly go above the speed limit. So the moral law is to be done in the circumstances, in those choices which it governs, not just at every single moment. That doesn't mean you're breaking it. So let's start with the first one by reminding ourselves about the origin of the first moral law, that we are temporal and created. I don't know if there's any doubt about that. We could raise questions, I guess, but you could look on your birth certificate and see, oh yeah, I had a beginning, and I live moment from moment. I can go through moment and then the next moment and the next moment, and we are a body soul unity, meaning what I mentioned above under spiritual and soul here mean the same thing. Also, mind means the same thing. We have a body, but we also have a mind or a spirit or a soul, our inner thoughts that other people can't see. You could just look like this, but you're thinking a whole bunch of stuff, and you talk to communicate externally what you're thinking. So we have both the body and the soul. And our soul, our mind, actually, I should say bisoul unity. We have a rational soul. We want to understand. In fact, that's where we can get to the good. So, given those things, the good for a human is the use of reason to understand or to know. Knowledge is our highest good. Now, this lecture assumes you've seen the other ones, especially the introduction to ethics lecture about the good is our highest end. It's the thing we seek for its own sake. And we can go through and show how knowledge is really the only thing like that. Money is not an end in itself. You use money to get something else. A house is not an end in itself. A car, fame, even friendship. You're not using the other person as a means, but when you have a friend, you want to know them and you want to know about life and experiences together. So even in friendship, it's still the knowledge that makes it a good for the human. And it's not merely knowledge of the many changing things, not merely knowledge of what is impermanent, knowledge of what is eternal, unchanging, permanent, or we could say real. Real versus impermanent. We want to know about how the world as a creation reflects knowledge of its creator. So you want to know the creator and you want to know how the works of the creator say something about the creator. And so the first moral law begins with, having given these truths about human nature, we say the highest good for a human is to know, and I'm going to put it this way, love God, the creator. And I put know there because you'll see that knowledge of God and love of God go together, because to know God is to love God as the highest being. You realize that God is knowable or the object of highest knowledge in himself, not because of something that gets you. And that makes God lovely in himself, not because if I do this, then God grants me 3 wishes, but that knowing God just is the best thing. And because of that, it satisfies your rational soul. So you say, yeah, I understand the world now. I understand my purpose in life. And that satisfaction then reiterates the love of God. And that God, as the determiner of human nature, is the determiner of good and evil for human nature. So you can think about alternative views to that. Now, let me put in something. Don't forget that point. Alternative views. With this goes love of God. The highest good is to love God and your neighbor as yourself. So to love God and to love your neighbor. Now, those can't be separated. However, when you say to love your neighbor, you could have kind of like an atheist version that says that's all you do. Loving your neighbor is all that God expects because there is no God. Or loving your neighbor is to love God. Well, it depends what you mean by love of your neighbor. Remember, love is seeking what is good for the other. So in one sense, you don't love God. God doesn't need something where you're doing something to help God get something else. Instead, loving God means you want to know God because you see that God is loveliness in itself, goodness in itself. But for our neighbor, when we love our neighbor, it's not merely helping them out with economic problems, like they need to pay their bill or they need a ride to work. Those are great things to do, but you could do those things and not love your neighbor. Loving your neighbor means you want them to have the highest good. And a lot of what we see called charity stops far short of that. It just is about physical suffering, helping people alleviate physical suffering. It never helps them learn about their highest good. So the first moral law, those things go together. Love God, love your neighbor. And why? Well, because God, as the one who creates human nature, is the one who created good and evil for human nature. Now, the objections to this, you say, well, humans are only the product of material forces, atheism or materialism. Or you could say, we'll put that down here. Or humans are God, pantheism. All things are God. Or humans are the product of limited deities or spirits in nature. Polytheism / animism. One more. Actually, I'll say humans are eternal and currently stuck in a body. Dualism. So they're eternally reincarnating, or from eternity reincarnating, trying to get out of the body to be a pure spirit. So those are views that say they're contrary, largely contrary to theism. In that sense, they're all atheism. Atheism just means the rejection of theism, but we usually reserve atheism for materialism. Now, you can demonstrate each of these not to be the case by showing, well, not all things are material. We do have a non-immaterial soul, and God, the creator, is immaterial, that matter had a beginning. And since something must be eternal and matter had a beginning, what's eternal is immaterial. Or that humans are God, you can point out, no, my soul isn't eternal, either for pantheism or for dualism. My soul had a beginning, an absolute beginning, not just the birth of this body, but I existed before the body. It had an absolute beginning. If I existed from eternity, I would have infinite knowledge, and I don't have infinite knowledge. Or that humans are the product of limited deities or spirits in nature. Yeah, but where'd those come from? Because you're saying they're limited or they're in nature and nature had a beginning. Those were created. So we look past them to the one who created them. So you can address each of those objections to show that God only is eternal. And as the creator, God is the determiner of good and evil. And so we ought to love God. That's where the moral law begins. Love God and love our neighbor. Now, the consequences, what if you don't do this? Failure to attain what is good leaves us meaningless, bored, and guilty. You recognize in life, see, yeah, my life doesn't have meaning. It's not connected to anything ultimate or above or beyond me. It's just connected to my desires or the desires of my group of humans, but nothing transcendent. And when something's meaningless, it's boring. If you are listening to a lecture that you don't really find meaningful, it's a boring lecture, let alone if it was in a foreign language that you don't understand. You're just listening to noises then, and it's boring. And there's always a kind of existential guilt attached to that, meaning, nevertheless, I realize I've lived a life that should have meaning, but it doesn't. And that ultimately lands on my shoulders. I'm the one who must take responsibility for that. I'm guilty. So those are pretty heavy consequences. And the reverse is true. Knowing what is good brings a life full of meaning, interest, and purpose. Life full of meaning, interest, and purpose, which is what we would want. And that can come in degrees. It can become more and more interesting, more and more purposeful as we understand more and more about the good. Remember, the good is incomprehensible, meaning not that it's unknowable altogether, but you'll never completely know everything. There's always more to learn. So now, second moral law. If we've got the first one, and really the one that summarizes all of the moral law, don't or love God, or the negative, love God, the negative is don't have any other gods before God. And you might say, well, there aren't any other gods. Sure. So don't put anything at all before God. Now, the second moral law comes from the nature of thinking about God. We often make, we can see a couple of mistakes that come up. So I'll put that underneath the objections. The nature of thinking about God, we ought to think presuppositionally. That means we ought to start with the most basic and build from there. That's true really of any subject. It's why in math you start with arithmetic. Well, really you start with numbers and then shapes, and then you get to arithmetic. You don't start with differential calculus. So it's true for any subject, including thinking about God. We're to start with the basics about God and build from there. And the put that into a moral law. We ought to think presuppositionally about God, not that God is like man, or that man is like nature, but that man is created in the image of God. Knowing what God is, and we could say not God is man, or also, or that man is like nature, or God is like nature. That's another one that's related. And so you'll see that, right? Someone will say, God's kind of like the sun. Not that it only is like the sun, God is the sun. Most cultures on earth at some point in their history worshiped the sun or the ocean or the earth. And so this is thinking about God as if God's a part of nature, a piece of nature, rather than the one who created all the parts of nature, the sun, the ocean, the earth itself, everything else. And so thinking presuppositionally means we begin with what is eternal, God, and go from there to creation, not the other way around. The other way around is sometimes called idolatry. It's when you say God's kind of like or God's a fish, and I'm going to have a statue of a fish and bow down to it, rather than no, God's the creator of the fish, created all things. And so we start with only God's eternal. And what are the objections to that? Well, the objections to that, God is a projection of the human mind, or God is a part of nature, or God is nature as a whole. And so the projection of the human mind part. Now, if you put brackets on it or quotation marks, you say God is a projection of the human mind, you're right. For many people, when you ask them what is God, you'll see what they mean is just their own imagination. Rather than beginning with what's actually eternal and going from there. Or in the history of humanity, it's been common to say, yeah, God's a part of nature. I worship the thundercloud. That's my God. Or that God's nature as a whole. Maybe when people thought the earth was it, they'd say, yeah, God is the earth. That's what I worship. Instead of God created you and your mind and created all the parts of nature and created nature as a whole. And so that's what we need to get to the definition of God. Theism. God is a spirit, meaning immaterial, conscious person, not merely a material, not merely a force, a material force like gravity. God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchanging. Those three go together and are called the incommunicable attributes. What that means is only God has those. The word is the aseity of God, the otherness of God. Only God is infinite, eternal, and unchanging in being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. So God is infinite, eternal, and changeable in these, but we can have those, but we have them in a finite, temporal, and changeable way. So the image of God, to be made in the image of God, means that we have these things, but we're made in the image of God. We're not God, and we never could be God. You can't grow from being finite to being infinite, or from having had a beginning suddenly go to having had no beginning. You'll always be finite, temporal, and changeable with these things. So it's important we say, well, okay, well, what is God? Here's God in contrast to materialism, pantheism, polytheism, dualism, in contrast to, well, God is just a projection or God is a part of nature. Now, what are the consequences? One of the important things to see is these consequences are inherent to either keeping or breaking this moral law. So, what happens when we don't think presuppositionally of God is that we have distortions about the nature of God, and these lead to divisions and cultural decay and collapse. As people disagree about the highest reality, what it is, they're no longer able to work together. They might start off with saying, well, let's just agree to disagree about that, and we all got to pay taxes and make money. But that doesn't keep going. You can see it in culture. You can only agree to do those things for so long. The way you make money and what's an okay way to spend it brings up questions about the role of God in life. And so ultimately you have cultural decay and collapse. But the other side is true as well. When you have belief, an affirmation of the true nature of God brings unity and continuity through the generations and increase of understanding. So you end up with more and more good, not just for yourself, but your children and your grandchildren, etc., as they contribute as well. Instead of having generations who are at odds with each other and break apart, you have generations more like sequential waves that push higher and higher into more and more understanding. Now, how about the third moral law? The third moral law, now we've gone from we ought to love God, have nothing before him, to we ought to think presuppositionally of God and not construct idols in our mind or physically. Now, third gets to we ought to have integrity. Well, where does that come from? There is a natural integrity to our being. Integrity means wholeness. All the parts work together. Lack of integrity means there is a break and the parts are fighting each other. If you have a ship and it has a lack of integrity in its hull, means the parts are pulling away from each other and you're letting water in, as a physical analogy. But I think you recognize that to lack integrity is necessarily a negative thing. No one says, that guy really lacks integrity. I wish I could be more like him. Or when I grow up, I want to lack integrity. This is a very important thing. So, integrity for a human is a concern for consistency in our beliefs and between what we say and do. So we want to have integrity in our being. And this could be at one moment or over time. Like at one moment, if your right hand and your left hand are like pushing against each other, you don't have integrity at that moment. Or if in one moment you said one thing and you're doing another, you don't have integrity. But also over time, it could be that for 5 years of your life, you did this and it completely undermined the next 5 years where you wanted to do that. And so in your life history, there's a lack of integrity. And so we expect people to have integrity. We don't even have to ask them. we assume you know that we expect you to have integrity. So we should have integrity. Now, the opposite of integrity, opposite of integrity is hypocrisy. That's a negative term where we all recognize no one wants to be a hypocrite. When you say that guy's a hypocrite, no one says, wow, I wish I could be like him. Hypocrisy is minimally saying one thing and doing another. But there could be levels of hypocrisy, meaning ordinary, everyday hypocrisy versus a person in authority. A teacher has hypocrisy when they implicitly claim to know. By teaching, they're claiming they know what they're talking about implicitly. They don't even have to tell you, hey, I know what I'm talking about. They'll just assume that, but they don't know what is clear about the basics, the God and the good. So that's a hypocrite also. They want to teach you how to lead your life, but they can't even tell you what's good for you, what's the highest good. And so the hypocrite avoids shame and guilt by self-deception and self-justification. The hypocrite says, I'm okay to themselves. They won't even let themselves know the truth about themselves. And then they defend themselves to others. And it's self-justification. It's a kind of, you'd think, oh, they're reasoning. They're using reason. They're using their mind. But we have a word for it. It's called rationalization. They have a fundamental falsehood that they're then wrapping around arguments to hide it. So it gives the appearance of rationality, but it isn't at its heart rational. At the most basic level, a person who has integrity as a rational being will know what is eternal and what is good for humans. And so the opposite is true. If you don't know those things, then you don't have integrity as a rational human. You've lost that integrity, and people expected more out of you. Now, our culture does a lot to hide it. We can hide this by focusing on practical and psychological concerns. You can hide not knowing what's eternal because you're really good at your job at making money, or because you're a great people person and you make lots of friends and you're able to sell stuff. Practical psychological concerns. But at the philosophical level of your life, it's an empty void. It's a confused mass. There's no coherence. And all of us will feel that inside. We'll feel that being alone and not knowing. And that's where it goes back up here. We use then self-deception to hide it because we don't want to feel that. Now, the consequences are that as integrity increases, clarity increases. So as you start to know a little bit that's clear, you go to more and more and more. More things become clear. But the reverse is true. As integrity decreases, stupor increases. Or the mind becomes dark. And you lose even simple basic distinctions in life. You're no longer able to make those distinctions with your mind. Those are very heavy consequences. Now, those three, to some extent, go together. Knowing God, who God is, how to think about God, and then we ought to know God. But then it's natural to ask, well, what do we do with it? Which is what the fourth moral law is about. We have to work to keep ourselves in existence. Even if you were rich and you don't have to work for money, you got to get out of bed, put food in your mouth, chew it. I mean, I guess you might get to a point where you just like you sit in a hot tub and they put an IV in your arm and you just have the IV going. You don't even have to chew food. But then I suppose your body's still working to digest things. You have to blink still and talk to the person who brings in the IV. So you can't get out of some level of working to keep yourself in existence. And the moral law is we ought to work for the good with true hope. And this is where what is good comes into play so importantly, because people will work, but for false goods. They'll work just for money, or they'll work for money to buy leisure, a vacation. And then that ends, they got to go back to work again for more money to go back on vacation later. And so they're working for things that aren't permanent, they're not lasting, they're not working for the knowledge of God. And so, because of that, they aren't able to work with true hope. They end up working and it becomes very hopeless after about 4 or 5 vacations in. And the vacation, you're just like, man, these vacations end and I got to go back to the dreary work. I'm not sure it's worth it anymore for how much I have to work for these vacations. And so, to correct that, we got to know what the good is and how to work for it. Because the truth is, we do work for money, but we don't work for money as an end. We then want to use our money to pursue the good. We work for money to pay our mortgage and our car payment so we can drive to work for money to pay for a car. But ultimately, we're working to have a life where we can seek out knowing and understanding. And so true hope is contrasted with false hope and no hope. False hope is aimed at a mistaken good or at a mistaken belief that the good is achieved without work. Both of those go together. So you might either have false hope, you're very hopeful, but it's false hope because your hope is, I'm going to make a lot of money. I'll be happy finally when I make money. Or you might say, yeah, the good is knowing God, but that'll just happen. I don't have to do anything. The world, in fact, gets worse and worse and worse. This is a theory of the premillennialism in theology. And then Jesus comes back. The church never has to disciple the nations. It just coasts along until the end. In fact, things get worse and worse. So that's false hope, because your hope is either in a false good or getting the good without work. No hope is based on the belief that good does not overcome evil. So you have no hope. You say, well, I mean, they both continue until the end. There's both good and evil. Instead of saying, no, in human history, good overcomes evil. The knowledge of God fills the earth, rather than saying they're both good and evil. The kingdom of God and the kingdom of man, the kingdom of darkness continue on until the end. Neither one of them is victorious. Well, there's no hope then. Nothing you do, no work you do brings about the victory. And even at the end of history, compared at least to the premillennialists who say good does overcome evil, in this case, even then it doesn't overcome evil. This view confuses the purpose of suffering as a judgment and call to repent with a permanent condition. So might say, the whole point of this life is to suffer. And that just continues on, rather than saying, no, suffering is also teleological, goal-oriented. And it has a purpose as well in helping good overcome evil. And so to have true hope, think of some objections, some common objections here. Cyclical fatalism. There is no teleology of history. It doesn't end with good overcoming evil. It's all just a cycle. Maybe good overcomes now, and then evil overcomes, and then good, and then evil. It's just like the seasons: winter, then summer, winter, then summer. And you just have that cycle forever. That's also hopeless. Or God overcomes evil apart from human effort. That's what I mentioned, premillennialism. Or humans overcome evil apart from God, secular humanism. By reorganizing the government and taxing the rich, we'll finally get rid of suffering altogether. We'll have no more suffering, no more poverty, no more sickness. And so you believe you can do those things merely through human effort. Now, there's two reasons. Now, one problem there is that doing those things apart from God, but also that's the wrong focus. You're also not focusing on the internal moral evil problem. You could solve the external moral evil problem, but it's like I said, tie someone down and they can't murder because they're tied down. But their mind still has hatred in it. And the government can't change what's inside of you. Reorganizing wealth can't change what's inside of you. And so the consequences are that work apart from the good is empty. Work for the good is fulfilling. So we all have either heard of or seen shows like The Office about or experienced ourselves the emptiness of work apart from the good. Work for a company you don't believe in its purpose, and the only reason you go there is because of money, and it's not that much money. You know, other people who make a lot more money. It's hopeless. It's despairing. But when you see how your hope connects up to what's of the highest good, and any work can, even office work can, then it becomes fulfilling and you wake up looking forward to it every day. I can't wait to go to work and be fulfilled because I know how my work helps me achieve the good. Okay, but if we're going to do these things, we're going to need some kind of authority. And so that's what Moral Law 5 is about. On authority. Now, the origin of this is that we are born ignorant and need to be taught. There's no doubt about that, right? No one's born knowing everything. And you come out of the womb and you're solving right there in the hospital, hour one, you're solving differential equations. No, you don't even know how to put clothes on or tie your shoes or nothing. You're just needing, you're in complete need in hour one. And it continues that way through the first years of your life. Someone has to teach you. And the natural person to teach you is your parents. Each person is the product of a mother and father. And those two have a responsibility to teach the children they bring into the world. And that is ordinarily how it happens. Of course, there are other situations: a parent dies, a parent leaves. But the truth of here is that every person has a mom and a dad. They may not know their mom and a dad, but every person is a product of those two uniting. And then there's a responsibility of their parents, of each parent, to teach their children, and children then to learn from their parents. So I use the example of tying your shoes. It's normally a parent who says, all right, come here, little Timmy. Here's what you do. Remember this: over, under, in and out. That's what shoe tying is all about. And now you learn that. You say, that's great. Now I know how to tie my shoe. So authority, in other words, is based on teaching. Based on insight into what is good. And so at the little kid level, it's kind of practical. Tie your shoes. So one, you can wear shoes because there's a lot of things that hurt your feet, and it lets you travel faster, walk faster when you have shoes on. And two, if you don't tie them, but you put them on, you're going to trip over the laces. They're going to fall off. And so this is some insight into how to pursue the good. Tie your shoes so they come on, they stay on, and also tie them in a way that's easily undone so you don't have to fight with a knot that you can't get undone and can't take them off again. So there's some insight there, but it's very minimal. Ultimately, a parent or anyone in authority must know what is the highest good. So that's the moral law. Authority based on insight must be honored. Authority without insight must be changed where possible. So where there's authority, you should honor that authority. And the authority is based on insight into the good. But where there's a person who claims authority, maybe they've been put there or they fought their way to it, but they don't know what is good, you should work for changing that situation. It could be that you point out to them in a respectful way, hey, you don't know what is good, and they change themselves. Or it could be that they have to be replaced with someone who does know the good. But what you want to be careful for here is that you don't do that in a way that violates the moral law. For example, that you have someone in authority over you who doesn't know the good doesn't justify murder, as in the case of a murderous revolution, like the French Revolution. So you can't break the moral law just because King Louis XVI doesn't know the good. You'd have to work for change according to the moral law. So the objections to this are that authority is personal. Authority is practical. Authority is psychological. So authority is personal means it's the children of the current ruler who become the next rulers. Because of who their person is, they get to be in charge. And we know from human history that, sometimes that provides those children with a good education. And so they are positioned to know how to rule better than the guy who didn't get that education. But we've also seen it doesn't guarantee they're receptive to their education or they care at all about it. And so they misrule, they mismanage their father's kingdom once they're in charge. Authority is practical. This is more what we have in the United States, which is we want a ruler who can keep the economy going, keep the roads paved, no more holes in the road, and no more recessions, keep us out of wars as practical concerns. And those are important. I don't want potholes in the road. I don't want the economy tanking. I don't want to be in a war. But those only provide us with a life within which we can then seek the good. If you have that life, but you don't seek the good, maybe you just use your time for personal pleasures, then that authority hasn't helped you. The authority might only be over roads. So they might say, hey, my job was just to keep the roads from not having potholes. Granted, that's great. But authority is also by example. Your authority was over the roads, but were you also by example seeking the good and encouraging others to do so? So even the government, the secular government, can still encourage you. It can't make you go to church, for example, but it could say, as our government does in the Declaration of Independence, here's the proof that God is our creator. That's perfectly fine. The Declaration of Independence does not violate the First Amendment. Or authority is psychological. This is more what you get into when you have a demagogue, where it's also personal, but they use their personal skill at communicating and charisma to bring you in. But at the end of the day, they don't actually have any insight into the good. So it becomes kind of a cult of personality. And so the truth is that you should be able to ask those in authority, what is our highest good? And evaluate their answer, especially a teacher. And there might be, some subjects that are more given to that, especially humanities teachers should know what our highest good is. But really any teacher should, even if they say, well, I'm just teaching you about engineering and math. Okay, but how does that fit into our highest good? And so that's the way that you work towards changing authority is first and foremost just by seeing, does this authority actually have insight into the good? Now, objection or consequences, let me put down a couple more of these. Authority here. Totalitarianism needs to be mentioned, which says that there is an institution in human life that rules all the others. So in the medieval world, it was the church. The church ruled over the civil government. But it flipped in the modern world. And now you have the civil government trying to rule all aspects of human life. Or in the medieval age, you also had the rule of a family. So in the government was totally ruled by a family, the Stuarts, the Bourbon, the who was what was Henry the eighth was Tudors, the Hohenstaufen. You have families that rule, and their concerns become everybody's concerns because they're in total charge. And that's in contrast to saying, well, no, there are different institutions in human life. There is government, but there's also church, and there's also family, and there's also business, and there's also education, and all of these serve the human good within their capacity. Not the same way; it's the same good, but they each contribute different things. The government's not church, the church is not government, the church is not a business, business is not church, but each of them needs to be defined in how it pursues the highest good. But also autonomy, the belief that you are completely free of all authority. The truth is, we need authority because none of us is experts at everything. And we need others to be that expert who applies their insight to life. But we also might even want autonomy over reality, where we say, I am whatever I define myself as. And we don't even recognize reality as an authority or anything else. We try to be purely autonomous. And that also is not recognizing that there is insight, there's truth and falsehood. And just because you think something or want something doesn't make it true or good for you. You have to use reason to investigate the truth of the matter. So the consequences here are that human dignity or authority, authority without insight ends up bringing disaster into human life, institutions, culture, civilization. Those are kind of building up. Your life with the wrong authority becomes disastrous. The institutions that you build up, like the ones I mentioned, become destroyed. The culture you make with other humans, and then a civilization, which might have multiple cultures in it, all of these fall into disaster when you don't have persons with authority that has insight into the good in charge because they're pursuing some other goal besides the good. So again, this is where you see it's inherent that necessarily follows if you don't know what is good, if the rulers don't know what is good. But the other side is true as well. Human authority based on insight into the good produces greater and greater meaning for human life. This is the corporate dimension to the good, which I taught about in another lecture. All of us working together produces more of the good than any one of us could do by ourselves. And so that's what happens when you have an authority in those areas that is based on the good. That produces even more meaning for human life and for those who participate in those institutions. So here we have the first 5 moral laws. We'll have another lecture on 5 more. But you see a pattern in the first 5 first, that all of them are summarized underneath love the Lord your God. But then the pattern is how the first 3 begin, particularly with the role of God as our creator and our knowing God, how to do that, and what happens if we don't. And then we're getting into the next ones, which we get into human work and how is human life structured around authority, which is based on learning and insight. So we'll continue to identify those patterns as we get further into the next part of the moral law.